Hello and welcome to today's lecture in the Women and Gender Performance in the Phoenician Homeland and Diaspora series, which is co-sponsored by the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology, the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley, and East Carolina University. My name is Brooke Norton. I'm the Associate Curator at the Bade Museum, and before we get started today, I would like to begin by reading a brief statement on behalf of the museum. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchiyon, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and their ancestors. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, and gender identity. In many global contexts, equal access to healthcare, education, fair wages, and human rights is contested on the basis of sex, gender, and other identity categories. In an effort to bring light to these timely issues, to serve a broader public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of those steps is the continued creation of public programming. Through this lecture series, we hope to highlight new and established scholars who are engaging with risky and marginalized topics concerning women, gender performance, and sexuality in the past. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work towards creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to now invite my colleague, Dr. Helen Dixon, to the floor to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Brooke. It's my pleasure to introduce Adriano Orsingher, who earned his PhD in archaeology at La Sapienza University in Rome in 2013. He is currently a Cesar Nombela postdoctoral fellow at the Complutense University of Madrid and an honorary research associate at the Institute of Biblical Archaeology at the University of Tübingen. He was previously a Marie Skłodowska-Curie and Beatriu de Pinos postdoctoral research and teaching fellow at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, Getty Villa Scholar at the Getty Research Center, and held various postdoctoral positions at the universities of Tübingen, Bochum, and Oxford. His scholarly interests focus on ritual and social practices, movements of people and material culture in the Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean and the wider Near East, with particular emphasis on colonial situations and cross-cultural interactions through an interdisciplinary, comparative, and anthropologically informed perspective. So I'll invite Dr. Orsingher to share his screen, and please join me in welcoming him to speak about Gender and Masks, a look through the Phoenician and Punic lens. Dr. Orsingher.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you very much for this kind introduction, Ellen. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I would like to start by thanking the organizer of this lecture series co-organized by the Bade Museum at the Pacific School of Religion, the Archaeological Research Facility at the University of California at Berkeley, and East Carolina University. I am very grateful for this opportunity to present some ideas and results of my research on masking phenomena, which ultimately has been carried out within the framework of the research project Face Off, Understanding Ancient Masks at Pompeu Fabra University. This presentation is organized into three parts. First, I will give an introduction to the Phoenician Punic evidence on masking phenomena, addressing its relationship to previous and coeval Levantine masking traditions, outline its repertoire and main features, and attempting to answer questions on who the Phoenician Punic masks represented, where and how they were used, who may have been their users and audience. Secondly, I will assemble the elusive evidence related to gender in the Phoenician Punic mask activities by using three case studies: a mask from Carthage in the Louvre Museum, a bichrome figurine from Cyprus, and the shrine of Sarep. Finally, I will draw some conclusions based on the threefold perspective adopted in this paper. Masking practices are a pivotal human experience that entails the individual and collective need to cope with liminality. They were usually meant to address events marking transitions or crises, such as the annual celebrations of the natural life cycle, funerary customs, rites of passage or initiation rites, healing and fertility ceremonies, and changes related to the solar-lunar calendar. But while these guise activities are attested in many past and modern societies, the use of masks is inconsistent and often limited to particular groups of people, settlements, or regions. Accordingly, a variety of masking phenomena and traditions existed and were embodied by masks of different shapes, sizes, colors, and materials. Humans may have masked themselves as human-like figures, animals, hybrid creatures with mixed human and animal elements, or even given themselves imaginary features. What is the archaeological evidence for masked activities in the Phoenician Punic Mediterranean? The data currently available are scanty, varied, and inconsistently interpreted by scholars. Theoretically, archaeologists can rely on three types of evidence: iconography, text, and surviving artifacts. However, there are only a few iconographic sources that have been tentatively interpreted as masked humans, mostly thanks to the work of Paolo Bernardini. Although they are worth debating when addressing the corpus of Phoenician Punic masking phenomena, their interpretations remain very uncertain. At the same time, the only Phoenician word which may be cautiously related to face-like imagery is pene, which means face, and it's often found in the expression face off, followed by the name of a deity, such as Tinid Pene Bal, which is known from many inscriptions in the so-called Tophet sanctuaries and should be translated as Tinit, face of Baal. As the Phoenician Punic word for mask is currently unknown, archaeologists conventionally identify masks with objects that portray a face, have a concave back, openings for mouth and eyes, and attachment devices that allude to or hint at the possibility that they were actively and practically employed in ceremonies. Even though terracotta facial masks are what currently remains of Phoenician Punic mask activities, one further issue worthy of consideration is the completeness of these masks. Did they originally include accessories and other elements of perishable material, and were they part of composite costumes covering more or less the wearer's body? This possibility can be sustained by considering some scanty evidence. In some masks, the presence of pierced holes demonstrates the original existence of metal ear and nose rings, which have been readily preserved, as you can see in the example from Sasperate on the right side. On the other hand, the presence of a row of holes along the rim of a Silenic mask recall a similar feature in contemporary masks, where the structure serves as a cap that covers the dancer's head and helps to secure the mask in place during the performance of the masked dancer. Iron Age Levantine mask making and masking practices stem from previous local traditions, which are currently limited to the Middle-Late Bronze Age Southern Levant and Late Bronze Age Middle Euphrates region and Northeastern Syria. Most of the Iron Age masks were found in sites on the Central Coast, a region conventionally identified with ancient Phoenicia. Because of the fragmentary status and the low number of masks found outside Phoenicia, our comprehension of the masking phenomena in Cisjordan and Transjordan is very limited, as it is assessing how they may have been related to the Phoenician masking corpus and practices. Nevertheless, in comparison with other regions of the Levant, Phoenician masks stand out because of the variety of their fine context and the complexity of their lifelike iconographies, which may hint at a variety of uses and meanings. This Levantine masking tradition was kept alive by Phoenician-speaking groups moving westwards and founding new communities and settlements in the central and western Mediterranean, where the earliest examples of masks found so far date from the late 8th century BC. In doing so, the Phoenicians maintained and at the same time renovated the Levantine masking tradition as a result of cultural context, new experiences, and ritual needs. Accordingly, both continuities and changes can be pointed out by comparing the corpora of masks from the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. Both corpora show the frequent use of painting, not only to render ears, eyebrows, beard, the complexion of the face and the lips, but also to emphasize some parts of the face, such as the ears, the eye holes, and the lips. This color emphasis brings up the issue of a particular rule associated with each of these parts, such as sight, hearing, and speech. Along the same line, one may wonder if the opening of the mouth in the masks of the Western Mediterranean may imply its rule through words and of sounds in the ritual practice. At present, Carthage is the Phoenician settlement in the Western Mediterranean, providing the largest, most varied, and longest documented corpus of masks. Most importantly, this was the center where the earliest new genres of masks were invented, demonstrating incredible attention to human physiognomy and the artisan's ability to depict facial expressions as shown by two mask genres, those with the twisted faces that you have on the right, and the so-called grimacing masks that you have on the left. The latest evidence of Phoenician Punic masking tradition dates to around the time of the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, when the occasional influence of theatrical masks and the rare occurrence is documented in a few Punic centers. The reasons behind the conclusion of mask activities remain open to speculation. Overall, the corpus of Phoenician Punic masks currently consists of around 130 clay specimens, with approximately at least 20 other examples still unpublished. There is a great variety of mask genres, sizes, and other features. However, this number seems rather small if one considers they were used in an area extending from the Levant to the Iberian Peninsula during a period of about 1 millennium. Thus, how much did the Phoenicians use masks? Could we define the actual size of the Phoenician Punic masking phenomenon? When attempts at clarifying these aspects are made, two observations appear particularly noteworthy. First, mask fragments cannot be always distinguished from other types of terracottas, including portraits of the face, such as protons, heads, busts, and statues. This may imply that in some cases, terracotta masks have not been properly identified, and consequently, the actual number would be larger than currently noted. Secondly, it remains debated whether or not, and if so, to what extent, the Phoenicians also used masks made of perishable materials that are not preserved in their archaeological record. Several scholars have suggested this hypothesis based on the reduced size of some masks, the absence of openings helping the wearer to breathe, and the fact that the inner side does not always fit human physiognomy. Accordingly, it has been sustained that clay masks were not always meant to be worn, but were instead votive objects inspired by originals made of perishable materials such as wood, leather, and textiles. There is some evidence for such a practice. In the Near East, figures wearing lion skins are known from 8th century BC in Assyrian reliefs, and even earlier, according to some Hittite religious texts mentioning the use of animal skins. More importantly, I have recently observed that the sharp cuts characterizing the facial features, and especially the cheekbones, in the previously mentioned masks with a twisted face were called hood carving. In my opinion, they provide the first clear evidence of the existence of wooden prototypes for Phoenician Punic masks. After this prolegomena, at least 4 research questions should be considered when analyzing the Phoenician Punic masking phenomenon. Who is portrayed in these masks? Where were they used? How were they used? Who attended the mask activities? One of the most debated questions is who is represented in the masks. The general opinion is that they are superhuman beings, a category to be understood in a broad sense to include divinities, ancestors, spirits, demons, fetishes, but also certain kings or chiefs that were elevated to superhuman status. The superhuman qualities in the Phoenician Punic masks will be more easily recognized when some facial signs, especially these, but also other symbols, are placed on the forehead or in other parts of the face. Furthermore, the superhuman status cannot be questioned for the Cyllenic masks that were used during the Persian classical period. Trying to better characterize these superhuman beings is certainly a primary goal of the research. Given the currently limited information on the individual fine context of the Phoenician Punic masks and their associated material remains, grouping mask examples according to common iconographic elements is perhaps the most useful way to begin the investigation. I have recently proposed to move away from the use of interpretive definitions and adopt broad and descriptive categories based only on entire or rather complete masks. Accordingly, I have distinguished two main groups, hybrid and human-like masks. Hybrid masks combine human and animal elements, and they currently include only Cyllenic examples. Human-like masks represent a larger and more varied group, where I have distinguished beardless, short-bearded, and long-bearded faces. I suggested interpreting them as figures of non-adult, young, middle, old, perhaps even older adults, adopting the length of age as the main parameter, arguing that they could have been perhaps mostly connected to distinct phases of human life, and assuming their use was often linked to different rites of passage and the cult of ancestors. Further categories could be identified within the beardless group according to the presence, absence, and length of hair, as well as other elements such as the grimace and the twisted face. Regarding the places originally meant to be used for mask practices, one can point out that the Phoenician Punic masks have been found in a variety of contexts, namely tombs, sanctuaries, houses, industrial areas, and rarely even in palaces and fortifications. Most of them come from tombs, but there is usually very little data on the burial assemblage, the position of the mask, the funerary ritual, and the age, gender of the deceased to reconstruct the use and meaning of masks in funerary context. In any case, one may wonder to what extent this fine context should be interpreted as the context of use. Also, one should keep in mind that the masks could have been stored, displayed, used, and reused in different places at different times of their biography. At present, their practical use can be certainly sustained in some selected areas. Based on their size, morphology, and the presence and number of through-holes, three different uses can be hypothesized. The Cyllenic mask of the Tophet of Tyre, for instance, could have been originally worn. Most of the masks, such as the famous grinning example of the Tophet of Mozia, could have been instead part of a mannequin, statue, or applied on a ceremonial costume. And finally, for the mask from the so-called chapelle carton, the latest example so far documented in Carthage, the normal size, 50 centimeters of height, certainly exclude a practical use, supporting instead its identification as a religious insignia, originally located close to the entrance of the small sacred building. In any case, some of the masks find context, such as the palatial building of Azor, the sanctuaries, and Tyre Bastion 8, testify to the association between masks and elites. Their occasional connection with the institutional sphere is further demonstrated by the reproduction of the grinning mask iconography on some cratulae of Rui Ibn Shabab temple archive at Carthage. These considerations, combined with the current limited number of examples, seem to indicate that only a small group of persons own and or use the terracotta face mask. Although the identity of these groups remains generally complicated to define more in detail, it is interesting to note how frequently the association between masks and children occurs in the Phoenician Punic Mediterranean. A relevant example is two masks from Cadiz, the only ones currently known that more likely represent non-adults. Furthermore, rituals connected to children are documented in various sanctuaries yielding masks, such as the Tophet of Mozia and Tarros, the shrine of Sarepta, where cultic practice refers to fertility, motherhood, and child protection. Children who therefore have been the recipients and even the protagonists of some of the mask rituals. This hypothesis is not surprising, as ethnography shows how often masks were associated with initiation rites. Although there is almost no data to reconstruct Phoenician Punic mask activities, in particular concerning their duration, their gestures, and movements that those wearing or using the mask would have performed, Anthropological parallels show that features such as mask size, the absence of openings for nostrils or mouth, the stiffness of the clay, but also shape, depth, and profile of the internal side, not particularly fitting the human physiognomy, do not necessarily prevent their reuse. Furthermore, masks could also have been held in the hand, close to the face, or placed above and behind the head. Ethnography shows also that the other individuals or groups may have contributed to mask activities by performing additional roles, such as musicians and dancers. Masquerades often imply the existence of an audience attending the masking activities, which would require considering their behavior and their physical, sensorial, and emotional response to the mask event. Would the spectators in the Phoenician Puny mask Mediterranean, in the Phoenician Puny Mediterranean, currently remains an exclusively theoretical issue. The audience composition of these ceremonies likely varied with the type of mask and its functionality. Further aspects to consider are the space in which these practices took place and the time of the day when they were performed. They could influence the number and composition of the participants or vice versa. Spectators and staging of these mask practices probably varied with the message to be conveyed to the intended audience. For the mask from Azor presidential building, one may assume a restricted audience composed of dignitaries and officials, namely those who were allowed access to similar buildings. In the case of Topets, the practices performed in the centuries would have either been restricted to a private family sphere or concerned the entire civic community. It is not possible to clarify with certainty to which of these two spheres the use of masks can be attributed. However, the original presence of metal earrings in some clay masks may imply performances involving body movements and sound. This possibility could indicate the use of masks associated with the execution of dances and even music, activities both documented in the sanctuaries according to the imagery of many steles, and which could suit better public rather than private ceremonies. While age seems a relevant aspect of Phoenician Puny masks, gender is certainly a more elusive issue. First of all, why scholars should consider gender when investigating masking phenomena? A first observation is that in many ancient and modern societies, masks were frequently associated with rites of passage or initiation rituals, which were often directed to specific gender groups. A good example is the clothing rite, which is celebrated in early December in the Eastern Alps. It consists of two distinct moments: the secret nocturnal initiation ritual for 14-year-old male teenagers to grant them entrance into the youth association, and the diurnal ritual ceremony for the entire community. Accordingly, one can assume that gender may have played some role in masking practices, such as in the selection of the users and audience, and in the message to be conveyed. However, what should one look at to understand the relationship between masks and gender? My suggestion is to adopt a threefold perspective, which allows us to consider all three main groups that may have been involved and or play a part in masked activities. The first one is the superhuman being portrayed in a mask. The second one is the person who used it, wore it, or was associated with it. However, scholars should be open to the possibility that nobody was behind a mask, which could have been instead attached to a pole or suspended to a wall, a tree, or something else. Finally, there is the issue of the audience. Who attended the practices involving the use of masks? When addressing Phoenician Puny masks, one should keep in mind that the answer to these three issues can vary depending on the mask genre, its dating and time context, and possibly also the region site where the masks were made or used. These three levels of investigation have been usually underplayed in the scholarly literature, where the prevailing art historian approach has determined that masks have been mostly studied as material objects and from a frontal perspective. A tendency towards a change of approach involving several scholars has started to emerge during the last 10 years or so. The first group, namely the superhuman being portrayed in a mask, raises the issue of how to address gender in face-like imagery. Engendering becomes especially problematic when the portrait is limited to the face. This topic has been addressed by Becky Martin in a previous lecture of this series, and in a recent paper by Agnes Garcia Ventura and Mireia Lopez Bertrand in the last issue of the journal Basic. In the Phoenician Punic case, the iconographic distinction between male and female masks has been traditionally based on facial and head hair, and their length and hairstyle to a lesser extent. For instance, it is usually assumed that a beardless face framed by long hair pulled behind the ears and hanging along the shoulders should be a valuable marker to identify female iconographies based on similar full-length figures. Similarly, the beard is usually considered a reliable marker to identify male figures. Identical approaches have been also used in the investigation of the masks from Cyprus and the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia at Sparta. What are the consequences of the application of this traditional binary perspective? First, female masks currently represent a rather small group compared to that assembling the examples identified as masks portraying male figures. A similar unbalanced proportion emerges also when looking at how scholars have traditionally engendered the late Bronze Iron Age secret masks. At the same time, debated cases emerge when analyzing the literature on the Phoenician Punic masks, with some masks lacking these two engendering markers, others falling in between these two groups, or with scholars suggesting opposite gender characterizations of the same mask, as you can see in the examples on the right. Accordingly, a certain ambiguity emerged from the Phoenician Punic corpus of masks. Is this ambiguity the result of modern scholars' difficulty in reading these artifacts? Or did the Phoenicians want to achieve this ambiguity, which may have been a significant element in the development of disguise activities? A remarkable case of gender ambiguity is a mask from Carthage, which is nowadays on display in the Louvre Museum. This masterpiece has been long interpreted as a male portrait. However, given the similarities with the bronze statuette from a Carambolo that we have seen previously, and with other Astarte-type images, I have connected this mask to female deities. At the same time, I have observed that the incised line running parallel to the jawline finds comparison in various bearded figures, such as the mask from Terrell Bastum 8. Accepting the interpretation of this line as a sign of facial hair and combining it with the overall reading of the mask as a female figure, I have proposed to recognize this mask as a female bearded goddess. A combination of textual and archaeological sources attest to the presence of bearded goddesses and more generally of dual-gender beings in the Near East. Omen tablets of the Old Babylonian period, sometimes of problematic interpretation, mention a bearded Ishtar, which may have represented Venus as an evening star and at the same time hinted at her as a war deity. Iconographies of bearded goddesses have been identified in a cylindrical seal of this period and a basal three-legged offering table from the Temple D of Ibla Mardit, showing a front-facing naked and seemingly bearded image of Ishtar Eblaiti, the patron goddess of the city. During the Neo-Assyrian period, a few hymns refer to a bearded Ishtar or describe the same goddess as both female and male. A controversial image of a bearded deity in a seal impression from Nimrud also dates to this period. During the first millennium BCE, various iconographies of bearded female figures are known in other areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, such as a fragmentary clay figurine of a pregnant woman with black painted mustaches and beard from a tomb of a man, who recalled the Phoenician type of the so-called Dea Gravida, and a group of dual-gender figurines from the sanctuary of Iarini in Cyprus. Notwithstanding the chronological and cultural distances of some of these examples from the Mask of Carthage, this evidence shows that the combination of female and male elements could have been used in antiquity to represent the dual personality of a goddess or the association between a male and a female deity. One may wonder if the same interpretation can be assumed for the mask from Carthage, although it remains so far an isolated example in the Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean. However, if one acknowledges that facial masks could have been part of a costume, markers for gender identification, if present at all, could have been identified in elements that have not yet been recognized, such as specific colors or symbols, or are currently not preserved because they were perishable and or located outside the face. There are parallels from modern mask activities that support such a possibility. Here you can see two selected cases from northern Greece and Central Africa. One, on the left, is the Bules and Genizaro Carnival Parade in Aosta, with flowers, a veil, and a wedding dress. And the other is a Pende mask dancer on the right, with addition of false breaths. Apart from the difficulty in addressing gender in the masks, it is important to keep in mind that what is depicted in the face may not reflect the identity of whoever originally wore the mask or was associated with it. In terms of age group, an interesting example is a child burial in Chaldaea, which contains a small-sized bearded mask. While one can connect its small size to the young age of the deceased, the latter clashes with its added imagery. Is there any evidence that something similar could be also suggested to the gender? Ethnography shows that there is such a possibility. Going back to the Bules and Genizaro Carnival Parade, one can observe that the Bula is the only female figure, but their part is an act by a man who is dressed as a traditional bride. Furthermore, to answer this question, I would like to focus my attention on a terracotta figurine reportedly from Episcopi in Cyprus. This small 12-centimeter high bicon figurine, broadly dated to the Cypriot period, is currently unique in the island's archaeological record. Although its fine context is unknown, a provenance from a tomb, possibly in Curion, seems a legitimate hypothesis due to its state of conservation. It represents someone bearing in the left arm a child who is holding something in the hands, possibly a partially broken object that is no longer recognizable. The larger human character wears the mask of a long-bearded figure. This mask genre is known in Phoenicia roughly between the 8th and the 6th century BC, while it seems to have been attested around the 7th, 6th century BC in Cyprus. Accordingly, its adoption on the island may have resulted from the close cultural and economic relations between Cyprus and the mainland during this period. This figurine, largely unknown to the main scholarly community, offers some elements of interest for the topic under discussion. Although who wears the mask cannot be defined with certainty, one can observe that the motive of holding a child is usually associated with female figures in Cyprus as well as in the Phoenician Mediterranean. If it was a male figure wearing a mask with a beard, there would be here an example of the contrast between the gender who is represented in the mask and the type of activity being carried out. Alternatively, if there was a female figure behind a bearded mask, this would demonstrate that gender of who is portrayed in the mask does not necessarily correspond to that of the wearer. If one needs to choose between these two possibilities, I would point out that the hairstyle or headdress, namely a long lock of hair falling on each shoulder, corresponds to that of a large group of drum players that have been predominantly considered female figures in the literature of Cypriot chroroplastic art. In any case, this figurine gives us also a glimpse of a mask event, showing how it could have been employed, possible users and audience, and strengthening the case for a connection between Phoenician-type masks with children, and more generally, their interaction with different age groups. What about the audience, then? The Shrine of Sarepta provides an interesting case study to investigate gender in ritual practices involving masks and understand the relation among fine context, users, and audience. A variety of artifacts, mostly ex voto, have been found in the small rectangular building, including a fragmentary mask that can be identified as one with long hair arranged in Egyptian-style cloth and tied up by a handband. The most important find is probably the inscription addressed to Trinita Astarte. The interpretation of this divine name remains uncertain. Many scholars consider Trinita Astarte as a double deity or divine couple. But Maria Giulia Marasi-Guzzo pointed out the oddity of a deity considered minor occupying the first place in the education and emphasized that double deities seems to have been particularly characteristic of the Hellenistic period. Accordingly, as an alternative interpretation, she has suggested, based on the parallel offered by the god myth Astarte, a translation as Tinith, who resides in Astarte. Tinith Astarte would be therefore only one of the manifestations of the cult of Tinith. Notwithstanding different interpretations of the inscription, it is noteworthy that except for a faience figurine of Horus as a child, that you can see on the top left, the published artifacts from this shrine represent female figures, and all the finds can be consistently connected to the themes of fertility, motherhood, and the protection of children. It's interesting to note that although the subjects and imagery of the ex-votus refer to a female sphere, the donor mentioned in the description to Tinith Astarte is a male character, Shilem, indicating that male individuals may also have participated in the ritual practices performed in the sacred space. This observation helps to avoid schematism in the interpretation of ex voto and in the reconstruction of who frequented ancient sanctuaries, as well as to consider the audience attending ritual practices in a sacred space, including mask activities. Furthermore, it shows that inscriptions and iconographies represent two different sources, which can be sometimes complementary to each other. This threefold perspective can be applied to a specific context. Tyre bust 8, where a long-bearded mask is associated with three other terracottas. A horse rider wearing a horned helmet, a figure with raised hands standing before a cylindrical object, and a portable shrine with a divine symbol or figure at the center. In a recent review of this context, I pointed out that while the mask is life-sized, the other terracottas are of small dimensions. The deposition in the same wooden box on the top of the urn suggests that they were intended to be used together, and therefore a miniature world interacted with a real one during the funerary practices celebrating a distinguished member of the local community. As the terracotta possibly represented a combination of superhuman imagery, the portable shrine may have offered a serial scenario for staging mask practices. What kind of mask activities one can imagine were performed on this occasion in the burial ground? Based on the previously shown secret bicon figure, I've attempted to give an hypothetical reconstruction of a specific phase of Tyre bust 8's funerary ceremony, thanks to the assistance and drawing skills of Esperanza Martín Hernández, who has prepared this preliminary sketch. Accordingly, one can recognize the protagonist in a figure, perhaps a woman, wearing a low-bearded mask and bearing a child who is holding something, possibly making a noise. The burial of someone who, from a significant family or social group could have implied a rather larger audience of mixed age and gender attending the funerary practice. Acting as the focus of the audience's attention and emotional state, the masked figure may have also used the voice for storytelling and thus amplified the multisensorial experience in the coastal scenery of Tyre bust. Taking advantage of the evocative power of miniature terracottas depicting divine imagery, the deceased rite of passage into the afterlife may have provided a real setting for tales revolving around divine figures, mythical traditions, and rites helping to cope with death. All things considered, masks imply a transformation into something else, hinting at the possibility of a change in identity, status, age class, and gender of an individual and or a human group. Accordingly, masks provide privileged arenas where these and other aspects can be negotiated and even reversed. For these reasons, a dichotomic approach runs the risk of simplifying and overlooking some nuances and fluidity that I've tried to highlight in this paper and interpret according to a multifaceted and intersectional perspective. Furthermore, a dichotomic approach to gender in masks does not account for the strict relationship between masks and liminality, which would support that the ambiguity in their gender representation may have been sometimes intended. In this regard, one can remember that scholars have recently observed a certain ambiguity also in the Phoenician Punic divine imagery, not permitting a clear-cut attribution of iconography to a specific deity, or a sharp distinction between human and superhuman imagery, for instance, in the case of the so-called degravida type figure. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. This is fabulous. Such rich imagery to work with here. We have quite a few questions already. We're really excited by this content. You mentioned at one point Becky Martin's recent talk in this series about anthropoid sarcophagi and the fluidity of gender representations in those contexts. I'm wondering if you could speak to any sort of speculative thoughts you might have at this stage of a relationship, or perhaps no relationship, between the terracotta mask tradition, which is much longer standing, and the sort of mask-like faces on those anthropoid sarcophagi of the 6th through 4th centuries BCE. Do you see there being any echo of the same concept, or is this a unique development, in your opinion?
What we can say, I think, during the Persian period in Phoenicia, there are very few masks. So this is the first observation I will make. Unfortunately, most of the masks of this period are coming from find content that are very difficult to be interpreted. There are a few from Byblos and from Sarepta and from Teldor. So and there is a resemblance between some of the sarcophagi of the coffins and the masks of this period. So there is the possibility that there is a connection, but what is the connection? It is very difficult to say at this point.
Yeah.
One issue is also that we have, generally speaking, we have very few masks, while we have a larger body of coffins for the same period. And I don't know if we should consider the person representing in the coffins as humans or as superhumans, such as, I don't know, divinized ancestor, something like this.
Right.
So one thing I was thinking of when Becky gave her presentation was the issue of are these superhuman representation of superhuman characters or not? So I don't have a good answer probably to this question.
I know it's challenging, but I think it's an interesting suggestion that, you know, those idealized faces with no wrinkles, no birthmarks, right? To assume they're human is a question mark. That same sort of hybridity you mentioned with zoomorphic or non-human beings could also be a sort of a hybridity with divine and mortal. Yeah. So, okay, next question. You mentioned in the Western sites where we have masks or Punic sites, there are many more examples of an open mouth, a mouth hole.
Yeah.
Can you speak more about the incorporation of spoken or chanted or musical elements in the masking activities in the West? Do you know of any textual evidence or other examples that could give us a hint as to what some of that performative sound might have been like?
Yes, I'm trying to find the here.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, there is one from Maxif in the Levant with the open mouth, and then I think we should check some fragments. So there were masks with open mouths in the Levant, but there seems to be in a smaller percentage compared to the one we have in the West. We we can support the idea of sounds and of a soundscape connected to mask activity in the Western Mediterranean, and the sound can imply the metal rings, earrings, or nose rings can imply dances, and dances requires music. So it could be a variety of sounds that can be attested during a mass performance. About the use of a voice, this is my speculation. So to my knowledge, there is no textual evidence supporting this. But in my opinion, it makes sense, but it is just an educated guess, I think. No more than that.
Yeah. I think it's a very, very likely guess, but too bad we can't say more. Maybe along these lines, I should pause here, and I should have said it initially that those who are watching live on YouTube, please do type into the YouTube chat box your questions. We have a staff member who will feed those into us, so we are happy to incorporate more voices here, but we have also plenty of questions waiting here. So one question from our staff is about, we tend to think of masks as enabling the performer to put on a new identity, to sort of see with the eyes of a deity or another being. But do you have any thoughts about the idea that these openings, the mouth and the eye openings, might also allow a deity or some other being to see in, to sort of focus on the individual wearing it? Has that come up in any of your ethnographic work or theory work? Is this for always seeing out and transforming the individual, or is it sometimes for seeing in and allowing a connection with that being more directly?
This is interesting, but no, I didn't find any in my readings anything going in this direction. But at the same time, if I try to imagine this as something happening, who's actually speaking to the masked person? Is there someone else with another mask speaking to this person, or I don't know? It's hidden. How it works? What is difficult for us, for instance, when we compare. We see other traditions, we can see that there are a variety of masks that have been found in the same context. And to my knowledge, this is the only evidence for that. We have it in Mozia, where different kind of masks have been found in the 12th century, and in Tyre. But I'm not certain if they were coeval or they were using different periods at the time.
Right. That's interesting, though. Yeah. So maybe further along the lines of the ethnographic work that you've compared this material to, can you talk a little more about which ethnographic examples seem more productive? Do you yourself have any strong feelings about which sort of communities have more relevance to the first millennium Levantine or Mediterranean contexts? How confident do you feel that the patterns we see in living communities today are applicable?
No, there isn't a specific culture or region where I look for parallels. Mostly depends also on the available study, because we may have mass, but I didn't find a study and interpretation, or there are no data, to my knowledge, for interpreting a mask who may fit or may be compared to the Phoenician mask. So I'm not selecting first the mask, the culture or the regions. I'm trying to read as much as possible and then going deeper and see if it works or not. using comparison, using ethnographic data, especially for connecting cultures which are so distant in time and sometimes also in geography, may be problematic. So I know, of course, that prefer not to follow this path. I believe that for the evidence we have, the archaeological evidence we have in the Phoenician Punic case, if we don't use this possibility, then we stop, and there are
only questions.
Only questions.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do is suggest perhaps other questions, and trying also to set the table for other scholars to excavate masks in the archaeological site and see if this hypothesis may work or should be or not. So this is basically my perspective to this body of evidence.
So when you say your criteria is basically to see what fits or what raises a question that could be productive, you're not necessarily like, this is within the material record we have here. There aren't necessarily other assumptions about Phoenician religion you use in that decision making.
Just to give an example, for this presentation, I started with the question: okay, what about gender and mask? What is the information I have for the Phoenician Punic mask? What is the question I have, and how gender has been addressed in masks of other societies? And I started reading and looking for that. And when I found, and I tried to find parallels and examples from different cultures and different periods, just to avoid using only the work of a specific scholar on a specific group of masks, and try to avoid the bias which are connected to a specific culture or specific period. So
Yeah.
this is what I try to do.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question from Barbara Teardo. She asks if you can say more about the symbols on the masks in the forehead. She's speculating that this looks like symbols of moon and sun, like in the Ashtart stele. We can guess it from the pictures. Could you speak a little bit more about what you think is going on with that central?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
Yes.
So basically, we have two cases. There are discs in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are tested on the forehead of mask examples since the Late Bronze Age, in the Middle Euphrates region, as well as in Cyprus. And they are later attested in the Iron Age, also in the Levant. And you can see here an example from Axis. And then in the Western Mediterranean, they are tested only in two groups, which are the grinning or grimacing masks, and in the mask with the twisted face. The mask with the twisted face, we can see discs and moon crescent, and this helps us to interpret the disc as a reference to the sun. So this helps us interpret also the evidence we have in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the case of the grinning masks, we can see that there is an early phase with discs, which is it is the earliest, and then there is a change, and there is a variety of symbols which are applied but not on the forehead and chin of this mask, and there is a tonic symbol, a lion head, and floral motifs, and then abstract motifs in the phase 2 and 3 of my classification. So going back to Barbara's question, yes, in one case, we can connect it to to the sun and the disk, I wouldn't say that the sun and disk should be considered only as symbols of a star. In this case, I think it's better just to keep it on a more general level and say that there are markers for superhuman beings.
Yeah. Then you mentioned the floral motif. Is it a single flower like a lotus, or what do you think that?
There is one, well, in mask 13, there is I can, okay. Here and here there are there is one flower here, another one here, and then and a different kind here. I've drawn all these symbols in an article in the Green Mask where they are represented not in scale. So there is a variety, and apart from mask 10 and 11, most of them they are unique. So there is a differentiation of the symbols in this mask.
And would you mind putting that one slide into presenter mode, just so we have a little bit more visual on those flowers and symbols? It's not impossible.
No, let me try. Okay,
Beautiful. Yeah, still quite difficult to make out, but you can see some of that variety, certainly. Yeah. Thank you. Ooh, I didn't even know that was possible. Beautiful. Yeah, I see. So these are, it looks maybe incised. Is that right?
yes.
Yeah.
Some of them are incised, and some of them were contained in the mold of the mask.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Maybe time for 2 more questions, something like that. Can you tell us a little about this incredible reconstruction of Tomb 8, Esperanza's reconstruction? Did you commission this? Was this in consultation with you that she did this? Or can you tell us more about the image and some of the decision making?
Yes, for sure. First of all, I appreciate very much Mireia speaking about the topic of the reconstruction. There is an important tradition here in Spain. There are great draft people working on this. So basically, I took advantage of the fact that there are a lot of people working on that, and Esperanza Martín Hernández is working on some reconstruction connected to mask activities. So we are working together. She's an archaeologist. So even though she's not a Phoenician Punic archaeologist, as an archaeologist, she's asking a lot of questions, of right questions, with a very poor answer on my side. But it's interesting also for me to consider aspects that I've been overlooked or not.
Yeah.
So what we can say about the Tyre bust Tomb 8 is that the group of terracotta was put on inside a wooden box, and the wooden box was put on a layer, on a burn layer, and the burn layer was covering the scenery rooms and the other pottery materials. So this means that they first deposited the urn and the other pottery materials, then made light a fire, and when the fire it was almost ending, they put the wooden box on the top of it. So I guess that this means that this group of masks should have been used, and that's why it was used. It was put on the top and not along with other materials. We are lucky enough that on Tyre bust Tomb 8, Maria Eugenia Aubet did a reconstruction of all the phases of the funerary ceremony. She proposed to consider the mask and the terracottas that they had an apocryphal value. On this aspect, I prefer to go on a different direction and try to imagine that it was not just an apocryphal value. First of all, one should consider the mask was put face down. So when I think of an apocryphal value for a face-like imagery, I would imagine that the face is supposed to look outside the thing. And then given the fact that they were made of the same clay and they were put together, I imagine that they were intended to be used together, and perhaps they did during the funerary ceremony. And at that point, I observed that the scale is different. So why having a miniature terracottas or small-scale terracottas and a large-size terracottas? And based also on this figurine from Cyprus, I try to put all of this together. But as I have written in the caption, is a tentative reconstruction hypothesis of the tomb. We have imagined that since Calabas tomb 8, it's the one was really the most complex funerary assemblage. The person buried in this tomb was someone important inside the community, being buried in Albas, and that's why I imagine that it could be not just the family but someone else. We are discussing with Esperanza about adding something such as other person, and we were discussing also the dress, because we don't know very much about it. So they should be naked, they should be dressed, how much, what about the colors, and so on. And I imagine that the person wearing a mask was not just wearing a mask, but was doing something. And that's why Esperanza, as a representative with the horse and rider figurine and in the hand, in the left hand.
I love images like this because it always acts as a test. What have I imagined in my unconscious mind about this ceremony? And for example, I would not have imagined the hole so big, for example. Tyre al-Bas, I think of them as those small post, I mean, just the size of the urn almost. But I think this is really intriguing to have a woman wearing the bearded male mask, holding the horse and rider, telling a story, and then presumably the other two, the small shrine and the figure over the bowl, are already inside the pit. Is this the idea?
No, we will add it. We will add it.
Oh,
but
okay.
we were discussing this. We were thinking also about putting in the background the fire, so that we can also have a layer about the smoke, and so trying to put all the data and into the picture.
So fun. Thank you for doing this creative scholarship, both in terms of the theories you've brought to the conversation and this kind of visualization work that I think all of us in North America are very jealous of how far you all are getting in Spain with this. So thank you. I know we're out of time, but I invite my colleague to announce our next talk to sort of keep our grand finale in mind. Thank you so much, Dr. Orsingher.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Orsingher again for his fascinating talk today. We have one last lecture in our Women and Gender in the Phoenician Homeland and Diaspora lecture series. So please join us again on May 16th for the conclusion of this series. Dr. Aida Ogiano will present Ritual Actions of Phoenician Women in the Levant and the First Millennium BC, Purposes and Modalities. I would also like to announce our upcoming lecture series for the 2024-2025 academic year, which is titled Migration, Borderlands, and Social Boundaries and Antiquity. So keep an eye out for updates on our website and social media for more information on this upcoming series. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and I hope you will join us next time. Thank you.